Ulrich, thank you. Thank you so very, very much for the wonderful introduction and invitation to do this conversation with Matthew and Jonathan. And I'd like to start by congratulating Matthew and Jonathan and you and everybody at the Haus der Kunst for this absolutely stunning exhibition. Matthew's greatest exhibition, and I think it will be wonderful here because I know that there has been a previous conversation where I think Matthew talked about the different pieces and all of that, to focus today on the collaboration between Matthew and Jonathan, how it all started, but also about this idea how actually Matthew's practice brings together all the different disciplines. So I think there are many interesting issues here to discuss, also in relation to the Gesamtkunstwerk. But I'd like to begin with a phone call. It was actually on January the 1st, 2000, that Matthew and I spoke, and after kind of exchanging wishes for a new year, century, millennium, we kind of discussed art, and Matthew expressed this sentence, which I never forgot ever since, which was a kind of a new hunger for him and artists in general for more live experience, a kind of a desire for live experience. And it was really this conversation which I kept thinking about again and again, which was then the trigger for me to think about more, how could one actually curate live experiences, and how could one actually maybe even do a group show involving live experience. And I then teamed up with Philippe Barreno, and we started to think, what would happen if all of a sudden with a group show, one would actually give artists time and not space, because usually when you do a group show, you always, divide the space, and then every artist gets a certain amount of the space. So we teamed up with the Manchester International Festival with Alex Poots, and it's maybe also interesting to talk about that for a minute, because it's the production context out of which the first chapter, as Okwi explained, grew for what is now River of Fundament. And it was a festival where everything is new, and it's interesting because it's interesting that a city would do this, because the city of Manchester, the mayor actually hired the artist and designer, the legend Peter Saville, to become artistic director, creative director of the city, and they came up with this idea of a festival where there would always be world premieres. Everything would have to be a world premiere, and it's in this context with Alex Poots that Philip and I could develop, this group show, this world premiere called Tempo del Postino, Postman's Time. And it's a complex group show with many different artists, but I just wanted to tell you a little bit about Matthew's piece there, because it's the point of departure, because Matthew produced a collision of narratives actually from Celtic and Egyptian myth, which was drawn from his own Cremaster series of films. So interesting also that it actually grew out of the Cremaster series. The project was a chance to restore the productive failures also that the filmmaking process is designed to edit out. In the course of editing, Matthew told me, you remove the failure, which in a way takes away something that was very magical. Everything that happens in post-production, that kind of kills that moment. So this idea of finding or also celebrating this magical moment. The difficulty and the beauty of live work, of course, had to do with this difficulty to remove such moments, and that sort of was really what prompted the piece for Tempo del Postino. And during the intermission, Barney had a group of musicians dressed as a military personnel marching through the foyer, and then the theater ending up on the stage. They carried a young girl on a stretcher. The orchestra played a score created by Jonathan Bepler. So that whole piece was, of course, a collaboration with Jonathan. And I think it's wonderful that today we can celebrate not only this great exhibition at the Haus der Kunst, but also this great collaboration between Matthew and Jonathan. And as in all great collaborations, 1 + 1 is 11. So somehow this piece in Tempo del Postino marked the beginning, and it will be interesting to discuss then maybe the different chapter in this conversation which went from Tempo del Postino to River of Fundament, that the journey led to LA. It also led, of course, to Detroit. It led through some unrealized aspects in Poland as well. So these are all things we might discuss and will discuss, because actually, as opposed to Cremaster, which is a non-linear setup, that whole path to the River of Fundament is actually more linear. But before we do that, before we discuss these different stations, we thought with Matthew and Jonathan this morning that it could be, and also with Okwi when we discussed before, how to structure the talk, that it would be good to actually begin with the beginning and start where it all started. As I said, it grew out of Cremaster. Also your collaboration, of course, started with Cremaster. So maybe, Matthew, we could begin with the cremaster idea. And I always think it's fascinating with, when one talks to scientists, they can say very precisely. I always remember Albert Hoffmann once told me precisely the day, even the hour, when he discovered LSD. And Benoit Mandelbrot, in a similar way, could remember the cloudy, rainy day when he for the first time saw fractals on a blackboard. He remembered the minute. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your epiphany with the cremaster. Do you remember when this all started and how it began?
Well, I can speak about the, let's say one of the scenes that within the Cremaster production where I felt like something was happening in front of us on set that would never be captured by the camera. And there were many moments like that, but I remember feeling that during the production of the Demolition Derby in the Chrysler Building lobby during Cremaster 3. And I think that I feel, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this, Jonathan, but my memory is that we often would talk about those moments and recognize them as being something other than what the film would be. And in other words, that there's something happening live in a moment like that, which has an incredible dynamic, which gets lost, I think, in the filmmaking. And I think that was the genesis of the River of Fundament project, was to try to probably more from my end, to sort of take these kind of physically driven scenes, and perhaps from your perspective, the scenes that were made live, the musical scenes that we sort of constructed and filmed live, and sort of take those ideas and develop a whole project around that. And I think it's worth saying, at least from my perspective, that that I think that your background with theater and performance is stronger than mine, and I think that with each of these experiences during the Cremaster cycle, where we were more or less staging something live and then shooting it, I was coming closer and closer to something that I think you already had in your experience and in your mind, something that we could develop further together. Eventually we started talking about it in terms of opera, using the word opera and saying, what does that mean to what we've already done together, and what could it mean to something we could construct? Would it literally be in the tradition of opera, or would it be a collision with that, or a conversation with that? I feel like that was another point of initiation for this.
Mm-hmm. I think the time I'm just thinking now, the frame that I worked with you is kind of spans the history of my involvement with, or my thoughts about working with film, for example. Mm-hmm. And so when we first started talking about working together, I didn't even think maybe you thought of it as film, but I hadn't even thought of doing music for film, or had no interest in that. And so I was doing kind of improvisation things, and the idea of kind of, channeling stuff from some higher power in the moment, and that's kind of what I was interested in as my own practice, where if I didn't play something for a week, I would feel like there was something wrong with me, So it was really something that it was about doing it physically for myself, and then also did performance things that involved a little bit other media, but not sort of 2D, like working with dancers, and also doing kind of performance-y things myself, where I was also a body, and then when we started working together, somehow around then, during that time, I started getting interested in film and this idea of, how can we sort of join these elements, and how can we make a beautiful? I was just sort of into the idea of making a good film score in a way, and then by the end, then I moved to where I am now, which is not being interested at all in making film score. So as you're saying, I think it's been pretty. It's these sort of in-betweens that have existed, this idea of how to place, so I think the way that it's kind of made sense to me is to take the stuff, take this kind of in the moment things that happen, kind of in space, and have that exist within, with your stuff, even, and if it's going to be a two-dimensional result, that the performance still exists there somehow.
Yeah, I think there's a way of from my perspective, of thinking about the difference in the let's say these two bodies of work with Cremaster and River of Fundament. That with Cremaster, there's, I think, both from a visual standpoint and a sonic standpoint, that there was a lot of dependency on an artificiality, that there was a kind of an interest in the artificial, both visually and sonically. And River Fundament was definitely about trying to take a more real approach with regard to performing things live in real time, recording music live on set or in the context of the performance, and then eventually arriving back at the end with this kind of hybrid, that's somewhere in between the artificial and the real. And for me, I think in a very basic way, that's what this project is about renegotiating that balance that existed in one way in Cremaster and exists in a very different way in this project.
Yeah. And one thing maybe which could be interesting, before we then go into depth with River of Fundament and the different chapters is, and to also understand what changed, after 2000 with this element of life becoming more important, is if you can maybe tell us a little bit more how it worked during Cremaster, your collaboration, because then we will understand more what changed. Because obviously during Cremaster, it was mostly, about the film, but both of you in that work already have to do with scoring. I remember, Matthew, when I visited you in the studio, often during the Cremaster years, there were always these amazing scars on the wall, really laid out with postcards and drawings, and almost like musical scars, like open scars. And obviously, Jonathan, you worked on scars for those films, so maybe it would be interesting that you tell us a little bit more about these scars. And I went to see Pierre Boulez last week in Baden-Baden, who was telling me a lot about this idea that, when you have a composer score, that's only one part of it, because then you have the score of the score, which is all this additional information, which is maybe not in the score. So I was curious if you can maybe tell us both about your scores and your scores of the scores during the Cremaster collaboration, and then, we move on.
I think it would be interesting to talk about our similarities and our differences with regard to structure, like setting structure on the front end, and the open-endedness of carrying the thing through. Because I think that there's a similarity there, which is compelling.
I feel like we both use. I'm personally not. I'm not usually interested in making a score that becomes an object. That people. I don't know why, but the score as notes to self, kind of in the same way as storyboard. It's a score for oneself. Just to make a score so that you understand what you're thinking of. And as opposed to a score, which is something that you give to someone else that they can just, read from, which is more common sort of musical score.
Right.
And
right, which is very similar, I think, in both of our cases. That my storyboards are not. They're certainly not frames that the camera will reproduce. Right. It's sort of more about trying to lay out the elements within a scene, and then the structure from scene to scene, but not necessarily what the camera sees. So it isn't really very legible as a tool for the cinematographer, for example.
It's
the way that a storyboard usually is.
Right, but it's in a way it's a score for yourself, for your own performance that happens when you get on the set. Right?
That's true. But on the other hand, I think like with you, that you have to write sheet music sometimes, right? You have to use standard notation for the string section, and I need to do the same thing. I guess with scripting for other people, like the scripts or synopses for any given scene are written for other people. Like they're not written for me, really.
Yeah.
So I think both of those things exist.
No, they do exist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to say for me the score, which takes. I mean, the nice thing about it is that we develop these kind of scores for ourselves at the same time with each other, but we don't need to. They're separate in a way. Like you don't need to read my score, and I don't need to. And but just to say, for me, it's something like it's information that I have, so that when I show up to musicians, I can use that, and then I would prefer, rather than giving them that, to just sort of make gestures to them. But as you say, there are some musicians where it's more appropriate to really just to write it down and present it to them.
Or if they're not comfortable with improvising, for example.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, I think another way that we start is with space, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
Because I think that's not very common for a composer. That it's often difficult for you to start working on a scene until you know exactly where it's happening and like what the sort of spatial limitations are of that scene. And so I think that, and the way that leads to the choreography of the musicians, which is often coming from you, about where music is placed in the room and where sound is coming from, that we kind of can't start writing a scene until that's understood. And I mean, I relate to that very much in terms of, everything from designing a scene to making an exhibition. Like I can't make an exhibition until I see the room that it's in. And in a way, I kind of can't make a piece without understanding what its spatial limitations are. So a piece meaning a sculpture or an object. So I think that's very compelling with regard to this notion of scoring.
And that stayed, of course, also post-2000 with all these projects leading to the River of Fundament. It always had to do with a real place. But I mean, maybe it's the moment now to kind of ask you a little bit more about this first chapter, what had happened actually with Tempo del Postino. Because so there is this phone call, you affirm a desire for, the real versus the artificial. You affirm a desire also for more life. And then happens this first chapter in Manchester. It had to do with many things. It had to do with an encounter you had with Norman Mailer. Maybe we should start there because it's such a good story.
Mm-hmm. You're starting to sound like James Lipton. Right, so I think it's important to say that before that incident happened, Jonathan and I had already started talking about what this thing could become, and I think because we were throwing around the idea of opera, the word opera at least, that the notion of what the text would be or what the libretto would be was sort of on our minds, I think, and then along came this phone call from Mailer saying, "Why don't you come to this event?" And the event was an awards ceremony for his French Legion of Honor, and it was very straightforward. He was given an award. He spoke a little bit I waited in line afterward. I waited in line behind James Lipton. And then I got to the front, and Mailer said, I didn't invite you here to see this award presentation. I want you to read Ancient Evenings, and you should read the first 100 pages and get back to me about it. I think that there's something in this for you. And so I started reading it, and he also mentioned that he talked about Cremaster 3. We had worked on Cremaster 2 together, and then we made number 3 after that, which he saw. And he talked about the way Ancient Evenings could be a film, and then after speaking to his son after that, I realized that what he was doing is he was trying to find directors for the novels of his which hadn't been adapted to the screen. And I think Ancient Evenings is one of these books that you kind of can't make a film out of, in a way. It's unfilmable. So he called me. But I did get back to him, and I said, I'm not really interested in making a film right now. I want to, Jonathan and I are talking about this opera idea. We don't really know what it means yet, but this seems like it could work as a libretto. And then we started talking about it, and I think it developed a bit in advance of the project in Manchester, but Mailer died within that year, I think, and suddenly it became very different for me anyway. That he became the protagonist basically after he died, and then the project kept evolving really.
And then there was also this very memorable journey. I remember we then drove in a car with the two of you first to Manchester to see the site, but then through the English countryside to find a bull. And it was an incredible research visiting these farms, and we finally met the bull. It was kind of, the bull was really in the center of it, was the main protagonist. Can you tell us a little bit how it evolved from Ancient Evenings to this idea of having a live bull on stage? And
well, I think what's interesting to talk about is that the initial draft for the project was for stage, right? It was for an opera house.
Before this.
Yeah, before Manchester, and we thought when the invitation from Manchester came, we thought, well, why don't we just take some of these ideas and just try something on stage and see what it feels like one scene, which is what we ended up doing in Manchester.
And this was the thing possibly at the Friedrichstadtpalast with the ice rink which comes up and the water pool and we had been talking about a beast involved there, right?
Yeah,
so
animals were going to be involved in that.
An abstract interest of yours.
Yeah. And there are these scenes in Ancient Evenings with the Apis bull and yeah.
That's true.
So it was, that was a sketch in a way. At the end, it was a beginning for the project, but I don't consider it part of River Fundament.
yeah, it's a sketch, and it was also fascinating that already the sketch announced that the River of Fundament would be a very long project of many, many hours, because the sketch, the rule of the game of Tempo del Postino was that every artist had 15 minutes, and yours went much longer.
Someone was encouraging that, though, I think, over and over again. I have to say. We always got blamed for it.
But a lot of it was already there. But I thought what was fascinating is that you somehow had already there the sort of master plan, and you wanted to develop it then in a much bigger way over several stations, and you had these very precise locations in mind. There was LA, there was Detroit, there was Poland. Where it would somehow evolve over years. Can you maybe tell us a little bit? Was that something you scripted at the very beginning, or how did this?
Well, I think there were certain mileposts for me anyway. One of them was Manchester, having that brief experience on stage and realizing that the stage was not where I wanted to be with this, and And I think it had to do with losing the most important tools that I felt that I had, like the close-up, for example, you know, to be able to really rely on the texture of something rather than the image of it. And for the viewer to be in a fixed position felt problematic to me with regard to the objectness of the piece.
Yeah.
And so I felt like a lot of things were being taken away from me that I take for granted as tools, you know.
Yeah.
So I've started retreating from the idea of being on stage and thinking more about these site-specific locations. Another thing that happened in that time is we took some of these initial ideas to the Berg Theater in Vienna.
This is true, which was before...
That was before Manchester, right? And it became very clear that a lot of these ideas would never happen on a stage. Like, for example, the idea with the machine that shreds the automobile in the showroom in Los Angeles. This was originally designed to happen with a machine coming up out of an orchestra pit and shredding an automobile on an opera stage.
Yeah, which, I don't know, that seems...
amazing.
But then it was like, then we had to talk for 3 days about how to get a machine like that in the building before we even talked about the safety, because they have these narrow doors for like sceneries like this, you know?
Yeah.
No, it became totally obvious also in Manchester with the bull that it had to go out of the theater, because it almost created a states crisis, how to get a bull into an opera house. Kind of like, so it had to be freed somehow from that constraint. And that really happened in LA. So can you tell us more about the LA chapter? Because I'm sure that many here present haven't experienced LA, and that's another important step.
Well, let me just say about Manchester, I remember feeling in a way freed after having dealt with this film thing where everything gets sort of frozen and everything is, it doesn't have, I mean, it's interesting you say, because everything has one angle at a given moment, but it is that, you're talking about what's freeing for you is that ability to then go to the other angle and to use the close-up. And I think for me, the difference in live performance was that you could feel that it really is happening from all angles, you know, that you can just be aware of that, even though you're sitting right here, you know. But so for me, it felt, the idea of doing something in an opera house with an orchestra and being able to bring other musicians in felt exciting. And there's the idea that we could still bring, for example, I had musicians moving in the audience instead of on stage, and there were no musicians where they normally would be. And then having this kind of process, you know, not just reading a score, and then the idea of the musicians being able to travel from, you know, from in the house onto stage, and that they had a little choreography to do, I was excited about that, and feeling like having some of the things that we had already, I don't know, some of the extensions that we had already introduced to the way music is used, and also have a live thing. But then, you know, from my end, there were things like musicians just kept quitting, you know, because they didn't want, you know, because they didn't want to walk in the house. They were afraid to like walk while playing their instrument, and but there's a specific orchestra, and then there was other musicians quit when they found out there was a bull. And you remember? I mean, it was really full. The process was full of these sort of frustrations, which you know, I'm not saying that would make us sort of give up or something, but I don't know. It did, you know, it did sort of affect things in the sense that that it was definitely much more difficult to do in that context, or it was limited often, you know, and we found a way of using our own space, or finding a space and where we could. Right. Other people didn't set those limits, you know, which is huge.
I mean, I feel like in order to make a piece for the stage, you really have to love the machine of the theater, because it's a machine, right?
Yeah.
And it's an interesting machine, but I feel like even in our case, if it was going to be about subverting the machine, you still have to have this respect for the machine.
Which I do.
I know, and I don't.
But even though I do, it still didn't work for me either, is what I'm saying. So.
But it's fascinating because there is obviously, you know, the ritual of the exhibition. And I mean, museums and exhibition since the modern era have become kind of, and it's a very interesting book about to be written. Dorothea von Hantelmann, she just presented the first chapters of this book about exhibitions as rituals, no? And in some kind of way, she talks about this idea of a ritual which can include a crowd of people who are, however, addressed not as a crowd, but as a number of individuals, very different from the theater, no? It's communicated to a crowd. And she also brings in this very fascinating text of Margaret Mead, which is kind of an anthropological text where she makes a criticism really of the limits of these rituals we have, the rituals in the theater, the rituals in the exhibition, where she basically says that, if we actually study ancient cultures, and that brings us back to ancient evenings, that we find very highly integrated wholes which satisfy aesthetic, that's Margaret Mead, as well as analytical, scientific impulses, and that actually throws kind of, most light upon the problems of the relation of art to present-day society. So basically, she talks about this close interrelationship between a phrase of a Balinese music, the design of a Balinese frieze, or a pattern on the border of a cloth, where we find a clue to the relationship between art and reality, for which our own culture is striving to find new formulations. First, the art of primitive culture, seen now as the whole ritual, the symbolic expression of the meaning of life, appeals to all of the senses, just as also medieval high mass involved all the senses. Through the eye and the ear, to the smell of incense, the kinesthesia of genuflection, and kneeling or swaying to the passing procession, to the cool touch of the holy water on the forehead. I mean, it goes on and on and on. It's a sensational text of Margaret Mead. And when Dorothea quoted it, I was kind of thinking, in terms of the ritual, the limited ritual you experienced in Manchester of what is the ritual in an opera house or in a theater, then the limits of the ritual of the exhibition, which is obviously the ritual, Matthew, you have worked ever since the beginning mostly, and then somehow the freeing from that through, what happened in LA, which is neither an exhibition nor an opera. Can you talk a little bit about
Yeah, I think it is an interesting thing to talk about with regard to the group of people who we invited to witness the piece. And I think, it became very clear early on that what we were going to do couldn't be repeated, and to a certain extent couldn't be rehearsed. It was with regard to the destruction of this, the protagonist in the story, the Chrysler Imperial. And so there was a lot of discussion about what makes an audience versus what makes a witness group, right. And in terms of ritual, like at what point do the people in the group stop taking responsibility for what's happening, and become passive as an audience, and we talked about it again in Detroit when we put together a group there, and I remember thinking afterwards in Los Angeles that perhaps there were too many people. Because I think there was some frustration about the behavior of the people in Los Angeles and maybe the lack of responsibility. Whereas in Detroit it felt more accurate. There's about 200 people in Detroit and maybe, 400 people or 350 to 400 people in Los Angeles. But I think that the discussion was often about that. It was about how can this group of people become part of the work as, and take responsibility for it in some way.
Yeah. I think I felt that I knew, I think early on, I'm embarrassed to say that I thought that I knew about working with an audience. And I remember we were talking about what we each thought what might happen, what we thought if you have a group of people standing in an open space and you present them with, something comes by and like 20 musicians are like, we're trying to, and it would be helpful to understand what they might do, to like whether they're gonna follow really closely or keep their distance and not enter the other space, and I remember feeling like I was wrong a lot of the time, what I thought. But there's something about the difference between an ideal audience, like as you could imagine how people will participate, and then I think the real audience has always been like a big disappointment to me, and but which is horrible to say because I feel like that's what I'm, like what I'm interested in doing, But but in terms of ritual, it's pretty interesting. I went to this, maybe doesn't have much to do with what we're saying, but in terms of ritual, I was in Bali recently, and I was really impressed at how people didn't pay attention to what was going on. That was like hugely, so I think that's part of my own education, because I think I did require, when I was talking about this earlier thing about what the audience would do, I always thought it was, I pictured something about this, this like kind of sensitive relationship, this sort of precise relationship. And in these kind of ritual contexts in Bali, it's really like there'll be this amazing thing going on, and then the people right next to you are just like chatting about whatever, and like not even, like really half the people aren't even watching, and then some people, really are, and then but what's nice about it is that if you add then there's a whole other thing going on, like on the other end that some people are watching. Mm-hmm. It's this great complexity. But, sorry, that's a little rambly, but the thing about ritual, maybe, one thing about it is that it doesn't feel, it's not that, it's not like art in this, where you feel like someone's making a decision about what's going to happen, someone's making choices about what the content will be. Ritual is like that it couldn't happen another way, that it has to be that way. And people have this kind of romantic idea that it's come from an ancient place, and it just has to be that way, and it'll continue to be that way. When in fact that may not be true. Like so often, rituals in Bali are sometimes more modern than one thinks. But anyway, that's a digression. But Matthew's work, I think, has that sense of that it couldn't be another way, and that it's you don't feel like he's just kind of making these choices for aesthetic reasons or something. It's like, why is there a car? And you get the sense that it just had to be that way. It's just part of the language.
But it's fascinating that you say, what makes an audience, and then this idea of the witness group. And so before we moved to Detroit, where the witness group became smaller, and that's something Rudolf Arnhem always told me. He actually said, any group between 12 or 18 people, it's difficult to be a witness group. But obviously, Detroit was smaller. But in LA, as a last question about LA before we move on, can you tell us about the name, why it was called Ren? And because that was almost like a logo. I remember when I got the first information on LA, it sort of appeared almost like a logo on your... Mm-hmm.
Ren is the first of the 7 soul states in Egyptian terms, that when one dies, the 7 layers of the soul depart one by one, and Ren is the first one. And Ren means secret name, or like the kind of internal name of the person departs. And the second state, Sechem, is the power or mobility, and it goes from there. Ku, the third, is light or vision. So they're somewhat associated with the body, some of them, and some of them not.
And Ku obviously brings us to
Detroit. Yeah.
But between there was some, I remember I had a vague memory this morning, I was thinking on the plane that there was something about Poland. You wanted to go to Poland, and that remained unrealized, and as you know, I'm always interested in unrealized projects. So there is an unrealized chapter of this whole endeavor. And then there was also the Mordachov saga. So can you tell us about this unrealized part?
Mm-hmm. Well, once we started thinking in site-specific terms for all of the aspects of the project, we also started thinking that each of these 7 soul states would be a performance. And so in the end, we would have 7 live works that would become one narrative arc. And it became clear after doing 2 of them that we would not be able to sustain this. And for a couple of reasons. One, that it felt like from the standpoint of making this arc, what we were capturing on camera was missing a point of view, like a traditional point of view from a cinematic standpoint. And so, I mean, I kind of felt like from the standpoint of direction, we had to change the strategy with some of the scenes and set them up for the camera. And there were other limitations that were financial, the sort of available energy and time. Like it took a tremendous amount of time, money, and energy to put together these live pieces. In that they had nearly the complexity of one of the Cremaster films, but they were being performed over the course of one day. And so it was much more, for example, much more expensive to put together one of these productions than it would have been if it was made for the camera. So there were a number of reasons why this changed, but it did. Another thing that changed over time was that, you know, we were exploring locations, as you're saying, in Poland. We looked at a mine in Mexico. And we had considered this theater in Germany that Jonathan mentioned early on. And I felt like the further we got into the project and the further we went into Mailer's text, the more American it felt. And, you know, both from the standpoint of Mailer's language, but also in terms of how to deal with the Egyptian mythology that's so central to Ancient Evenings. That, you know, Mailer uses the core Egyptian myth, you know, throughout the text in a very direct way. You know, he kind of pulls the more pornographic part that's already in there to the forefront, but it really, you know, reads like the core Egyptian myth. And I found this kind of terrifying, you know, how to deal with such a fundamental story, one that everybody knows, in a way that wouldn't be a cliche. And I think one of the ways out for me was to really focus on the Americanness of the novel and to find locations in the States where we could draw the sort of mythological aspect of the story out in an unexpected way. To use Detroit, which is obviously a mythological city, for example. Mm-hmm.
And Detroit obviously also has to do with this whole cycle of life and death, which is so present in Ancient Evenings. And the late Cedric Price, the visionary English urbanist, always said, you know, we should never think cities are forever. Sometimes cities do die, and obviously Detroit is not that Detroit would have died, but it's gone through near-death experiences, we could maybe say. And so in some kind of way, maybe it's interesting to talk a little bit more about death and life and Detroit, and also James Lee Byers, who is obviously the great master in the art world of death rituals. I always remember during the years when I lived in Paris, he, on several occasions, I was invited to a farewell, you know, basically event for James Lee Byers, who would be very ill and would go to Egypt and die. And a couple of months he was back again, and there was another event. And then actually, when it happened the last time at the Cartier Foundation, you know, very few people went, because obviously there have been so many of these events. I won't say goodbye to James E. Byers, but I thought it would urge him to go there. So we were only 10 or 15 of us were there in the garden of the Cartier Foundation. Mariko Mori was the only one who took pictures, so he actually has pictures of that last performance of James E. Byers. And, you know, we were waiting kind of, you know, for about an hour and having something to drink, and then all of a sudden he would actually show up in that, you know, Fondation Cartier garden, designed by Lothar Baumgarten, in a golden suit for a few seconds, and would disappear again and go back to the hotel. And then the next day he left for Egypt, where he died, and he's, you know, buried in the Egyptian cemetery of Cairo. I went to see the graveyard. It's incredibly fascinating. It's, you know, he's buried there next. It's a very strange community of people buried in the Egyptian cemetery, the American cemetery, in Cairo. And so yeah, James Lee Byers, to cut a long story short, death rituals, and also Egypt, of course, and Detroit.
Yeah. Well, that's rehearsals, no?
Yeah.
Rehearsals, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the things I really like about Byers, this notion of rehearsal. And and the artificiality, that I think it was probably a way for me to pull the artificial back into this project that was so relentlessly real, especially when we were working in Detroit, and to think about the way buyers would relied so much on the veneer, the sort of thin veneer of gold over the top of something, and how with the text, I was starting in Detroit, especially starting to put together a kind of progression of metals, starting with the cast iron work that was made in Detroit, and thinking about the novel, how there's this sort of ambition, unrealized ambition of the protagonist in the text, that he wants to be like the Pharaoh. He wants to have everlasting life. He wants to be gold, but he can't be gold. He can be brass, maybe, but he can't be gold. And so it got me really interested in taking the sort of starting point of iron and thinking about the metallurgy that followed the Iron Age, of bronze, which is an alloy, a copper alloy, and the kind of redness and yellowness of these alloys that use copper as a notion of a false gold, basically, a yellowness but not a goldness. And so there's something in buyers that's like that, it's the ambition of gold, but it isn't gold, and so he became really useful in that way in the narrative in Detroit, as this Osiris character who ambitioned to be Osiris, let's say. Mm-hmm.
And he was from Detroit, no?
He was born in Detroit, yeah, died in Egypt, so there's a number of reasons why he worked in the piece that way.
And so the title is KHU. It's a word from these 7 words, and again you used it almost like a logo in your drawing for it, and that stands for light. Can you tell us a little bit more about the sort of overall master plan? Because it's a very, very epic. A very, very epic piece, and it had to do, of course, also with this group of testimonies enduring, extreme weather. It was, in this sense, an endurance not only in terms of the performance you did, but also the viewer became, in this sense, involved. For all of those who haven't been there, it might be great to just hear a little bit from you how it evolved, and then also bring it back to the discussion of the scar. I think it would be very interesting. You told us so beautifully how you worked in different ways on scars on Cremaster, and now we've moved on fully into the river of Fundament land. It would be great to hear also the second question, maybe how the scoring is different for Matthew and for Jonathan in this piece.
Do you want to talk a little bit about Detroit and like the metal-ins, for example? I think that would be an interesting way to talk about both the weather and one of the just one of the elements of that particular part of the project, of taking a very, very concrete approach to music making and object making, and then bringing Detroit Symphony Orchestra people and into the fold and asking them to perform these instruments.
Right. For anyone who hasn't seen it, there's a small orchestra which plays instruments which we made ourselves from sheet metal, and actually the original the reason why I started thinking about viols made of metal is from the previous script that we had written for a mine in Mexico. It's okay to talk about it. And we talked about, going down, 500 meters, and this in this mine, it's close to a kind of active sort of lava. So if you go down to this level in the mine, it's hotter than a sauna, and you just go like.
Wow! So there was a script for that unrealized Mexico.
That's
chapter.
right, yeah. And so the experience of going down, you ride down in a truck and you find your seat is literally just a pool of sweat. And then, so the idea was that we still believed that we were going to have a performance down there and have people have them be allowed to come down there. And so when we have this performance down there, when we have this chamber orchestra of string players, what will they play? Because their violins will probably just melt and fall apart. Like literally the glue would just go, And so I had thought then, well, we could make, they'd have to be metal or plastic or something like that. And then later on, when a year or so later, when we went to Detroit, we did a lot of site visits and experiencing assembly line and the auto industry, and it's quite an obvious thing to be inspired by to have possibly the idea that we could have instruments made, be part of this sort of product that's being turned out, could be instruments, and then we could see that happening, and they are kind of automotive, and then there's this idea of maybe a primitive assembly line in the sense of this object that comes out being an ideal object, but also in a way a failure. And then the idea that someone, so we have an assembly line and someone comes to pick up one of the products that's made, and they're sort of someone who tests, So they're sort of trying the instrument out, and then they just kind of keep playing, and the next person comes and picks up the next one when it's ready. And then it becomes sort of a duet. And it was pretty exciting, and also the idea that the amount of time that it took to make the next one determined what happened with the music. So and I think in reality it was something like 5 minutes. So it was a 5-minute solo, and then it was a duet for another 5 minutes, and then another. So that, and just the idea that these instruments were they're very successful. Like, I think they're beautiful, but they're also total failures. They're just like, which we were always quite excited about that too, and it seemed to address the Detroit idea nicely. Yeah.
Right. But it's true that when we went outside with those instruments, and the weather changed, they became basically mute. No.
Yeah, we had done the performance. They did, yes. And I wasn't very happy about that. No, we had our musicians out on the barge, and it was like 0 degrees, and just like rain, almost snow, and and they're clutching these things. But and when a bow gets wet, it doesn't make a lot of sound. So
But Matthew, I thought it would be great to hear from you a little bit, because you told me in that very first conversation we had about your desire to do this obviously more risky life project. You talked about this desire also to not remove failure. This idea that you to quote, you remove the failure, which in a way takes away something that was very magical. Everything that happens in post-production that kind of kills that moment. Can you talk a little bit about that sort of aspect of the importance of failure?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that there's an obvious, large ambition, right, for the scale of these things, and I think part of that has to do with setting up a situation that cannot go the way it's planned, and I'm thinking of some of these things that happened in those performances that, again, were not really rehearsable and they were not repeatable. Like the iron casting in Detroit, or the dredging of the automobile in the River Rouge in Detroit, or the shredding of the automobile in Los Angeles. Like, these things were, I think, by design made to, to be a kind of untamable animal in the center of the production, and. So it isn't necessarily that we had the ambition to fail, but I think that there is an ambition to kind of keep the possibility of failure always present, and I think that in terms of my interest as an object maker, I think I've always been interested in that. In terms of the experimentation with material and pushing material to a place where it doesn't want to be. But I think with Jonathan and I think that there was as one of our meeting points is to try to find where his interest in improvisation as a composer and my interest in, experimenting with materials that way, or experimenting with film production that way, of pushing it to a place where it may or may not work. That it was one of the places that we could meet, I think. And I think it's interesting the way that you brought all of these, quite well-known improvisers into the fold when we started working in New York. That the production ended in that place. It was very much about that.
Yeah, I was going to say that there's something about there's a way in which this kind of sense of failure, or for me it's like, in a way an availability. Like it doesn't feel like even the performer knows what it's supposed to be. Mm-hmm. So that could have been another way, and like it includes all these other ways that it could have been. Mm-hmm. But I feel like that's contained in the casting. Like we talk about casting a little bit.
Casting people.
Yeah, because I feel like I feel like in some of the earlier stuff there were, in a way, there in terms of people, there were more musicians than characters, or some people playing characters. Mm-hmm. But I feel like in the casting, for me, certainly in casting musicians and singers, there is this sense of having people where it's not necessarily that easy for them to do what you're asking them to do, and mm-hmm. and I think it also exists in the casting of characters, and often we cast together because someone will be a singer and a character, or someone will start out as a music casting and then become a character because of the way things develop.
Now that's indeed a super interesting point, which was actually my next question. It would be great also, Messi, to hear from you a little bit about the casting, because it's interesting that it actually all started in terms of the River Fundament and that whole series of projects we've been discussing today started, with you casting Norman Mailer in a way. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it would be great to hear a little bit about the importance of casting and how that changed.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's a pretty broad range of choices that are made. I don't think it comes from one particular interest in, working with somebody. I think that sometimes it's more conceptual. Sometimes it's about, like with Mailer, it's about creating this kind of constellation of fathers, for example, which I think was very true in Cremaster 2, where Mailer played Houdini and I played Gilmore, and the bull replaced Gilmore. So there was a constellation of fathers in that piece that I think influenced my interest in this piece of casting Norman Mailer's son, John Mailer, as the first of the Normans, for example. That, that his casting was more conceptual in that way, mm-hmm. Although he is a performer, whereas other performers were really cast based on their ability as a performer, purely, while others were cast kind of in between, that they that they represent something significantly that aligns with the structure of the piece, but they also bring something performance-wise to the table. And then there's that whole section at the beginning of the film where Rushdie and Eugenides and Liz Smith and so on, Elaine Stritch, these characters who had something to do with Mailer's life, are present at this scene, which is a wake. So, that's a much more kind of concrete approach to casting. So there are a number of ways people are cast.
There's also obviously this aspect of, often, and I only have about 2 or 3 more questions. I promised Oku it will not be a marathon because we have the book signing coming soon. So I've got 2 or 3 last questions. But about the casting, actually, I was thinking also when listening to you that in some kind of way, Norman Mailer, I mean, it's so incredible what a kind of a public figure he was at some point in the US. I read a biography the other day, and I mean, he was, one could say, a public intellectual. Mm-hmm. And I once discussed Mailer also with Alain Robbe-Grillet, and we there was this moment in the late 50s, early 60s. I mean, it was the Nouvelle Vague in cinema, the early films of Godard and all the others, and of course the Nouveau Roman with Robbe-Grillet and Claude Simon, the others. So in some way, and I was Mailer in the States at the same time, and Robbe-Grillet once phrased it like this when we discussed it, and actually with you, Matthew, because we were in Iceland together with you and Alain Robbe-Grillet watching Marienbad, and in an old schoolhouse. It was a magical experience, and Robbe-Grillet all of a sudden talked about this idea, but then Jambot summarized in that meeting saying that there was a desire there in the late 50s, early 60s to be most advanced, yet acceptable. So this idea that actually something could be extremely experimental, yet also accessible, mm-hmm. and understood by people beyond, the world of art, the world of cinema. And that's obviously true for early Godard movies. That's true for that early moment of the Nouveau Roman, and that's extremely true for Norman Mailer, who was always experimenting and, invention of new journalism, new forms of writing, yet it was extremely accessible. Mm-hmm. And I was suddenly thinking, also if you look at your casting, there very often you involve very public figures, and there is something of that maybe most advanced kind of research, yet also reaching out. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, something that I've been thinking about quite recently that in terms of Mailer, that I think that he that my generation has inherited something from him, which is to do with this, like the way that we take for granted the possibility of working in multiple mediums. That it isn't really about trespassing, the way it may have been for Mailer. Like when he ran for mayor, for example, he was trespassing and he knew it. He was provoking something. And at the same time, at the end of his life, you could look back and say, well, his practice was in equal parts literature, journalism, political commentary, sports writing, like all of these things in one person. And so I have started thinking that way about him, that there's something about my generation and the way that we take for granted being able to work in different mediums without feeling like we're trespassing. Although I like very much the idea of trespassing. I don't think I feel like I'm trespassing actually to make a piece in the tradition of opera or a exhibition of sculpture cast in metal or drawings, or it isn't really about that. It isn't about mixing mediums as much as it is just about using the tools that are available. And I inherited that from somewhere, and I think Mailer is a part of that. And I think that's quite interesting. And you like mentioned the Gesamtkunstwerk earlier. Like that's obviously a question that many people are asking now about this project. Like, to what extent is it a Gesamtkunstwerk? And I feel like that term is so much about Wagner. It's so much about a different time. Yeah. And Wagner it's like he built the house, like he built the housing for the action. Like that makes it a Gesamtkunstwerk for me, that the container and the contained are both considered. I don't think contemporary opera, for example, is a Gesamtkunstwerk just because it mixes mediums. Like it doesn't consider the housing, it doesn't consider the architecture, really, because the architecture is a machine, it's already there. And I don't know.
Yeah, but that's actually something I wanted to ask you. That was my last question about architecture. But maybe, Jonathan, can you say something about that kind of most advanced yet acceptable thing in music. Is that?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear what you're saying, because I think sometimes the music appears and is referred to as a collection of sort of different styles, but I think you put it well, which is how I feel about it too. That it's not like going to this limitation or going to that limitation, but really this idea that that is available, and that's all sort of part of me somehow. So it's interesting that, for example, pop elements doesn't mean that you're going to a different world, but it's somehow, I don't know if it's somewhat American, maybe not, but this this sense of that, this sort of pop culture and the things that you sort of grew up with are just in you, and you don't, and it's in a way liberating not to. I think you and I both tend to be kind of inclusive anyway, in terms, but not to have to exclude things is suddenly hugely, it's a huge relief, and it's nice that it can feel, natural.
And Matthew mentioned architecture, and that's actually one of the many things I find so fascinating about the show here at the Haus der Kunst. When Okwi showed me the exhibition before, he showed me how you actually went beyond the building. There had to be an annex built to the Haus der Kunst to have that last sculpture in the show. And that sort of idea, how you actually use architecture and often also transform architecture. I remember when we worked at the show at the Serpentine, it was the first time ever that actually an artist spilled, like here you spill beyond the building. There you did it by opening the doors, so we had the doors open at all times. Air came in, it changed completely the experience because we had the fresh air, the park. And then you sort of spilled the sculpture out, almost like a cast outside into the park. And here you kind of extended the building. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that, the sort of idea of architecture in the work?
Well, for sure. Here, one of the things that interested me first about this building are the doors. Basically, that there's a succession of doors and a succession of chambers that. I think the doors here are very provocative in terms of their scale and in terms of the finishing around the door, that they're, that there's something experiential about moving from one space to another in this architecture. And, I'm obviously narrative in the way that I think, in the way that I put together an exhibition. So I think to have this succession of chambers and with the provocation of the orifice or the opening into the next episode is important to me, and it's useful. It's a very easy building for me to work with in that way, beyond the obvious, which is that it certainly has Egypt in mind, doesn't it? This building,
Could almost be an amazing conclusion. I do, however, have one very last question. We need to talk about books. Mm-hmm. And it was actually Anthony Powell who said this wonderful sentence, title of a book, books do furnish a room. And I think Lawrence Wiener used that sentence as well. Now, I was looking yesterday, preparing for today at all your catalogs, and it's really striking that from the very, very beginning, when one looks at your first catalog, I think in San Francisco, when you were 22 or 23 years old, to now, every single of your publication is not just a mere catalog. It's always an extension of the show into another space. You're very involved in the books. And I think in any case, artists' books and artists' kind of catalogs where artists are involved are such an important part of art history, which is not discussed enough. And in your case, it's almost, if one looks at all your books, it's almost like an exhibition of printed matter. And the book here, River of Fundament, is a particularly amazing book. It includes even an insert with actually the drawing restrained you did here. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about this, the importance, because it's very often something which is not discussed in the center of the practice, bookmaking. But I think it's extremely important. I've just done a book on all of Gerhard Richter's books, and he's worked on artist books for years, and that's an important aspect of his practice, where he gives as much time often as to an exhibition. And for you as well, for all these exhibitions, there are these books you very much care about. You're involved in often also in the design, you're involved in the way the book works. Can you tell us about books in general in your practice, the architecture of books, and then about this wonderful book, River of Fundament, which will be launched in a few minutes?
Well, I mean, the books often come last in any given project, and I think that there's a symmetry to the way the project begins, which is with the storyboarding, which is structural. You know, it's about mapping the structure of the piece in the beginning, and I think the books often are designed around that structure. You know, the episodic structure of the piece, or the stations within a kind of more nonlinear piece like Cremaster. So I think that the books end up being an interesting counterpart to the storyboarding that starts the project. You know.
Can you tell us about the book here? Because it's actually fascinating, because it's almost like a Russian matryoshka. There are many books within the book, and there are these wonderful little program books, because when you did the actual performances, I remember with Ku, but also with Ren, you actually, send out these little program books. They were almost like the thing, for people to testimony it with. They hang on to this little book, and here they were reprinted. There are these little books within the book. Then, of course, there is Jonathan's car. That's another book within the book. And last but not least, there's another book within the book. There is the drawing restraint. So it's like a Russian matryoshka.
Yeah. Well, the inserted books they're playbills, effectively. And it was one of the things that along the way that we were interested in, aligning with the opera tradition of that ubiquitous format of the playbill, and how it can bring a kind of a subtext to the performance, and in the form of the libretto and accompanying texts, and so I found the playbill very useful in that way, and I think it's useful within the book to remind that the project included these autonomous events, beyond the scope of the exhibition or the film. And
Jonathan, can you tell us about the scar, which is in the book?
It was, They are. It was a little bit harrowing, actually, to have the idea of the scores appearing in a book, because they've never been sort of meant to be finished that way or seen that way. So yeah, I find it scary.
And then last but not least, there is the poster, and that's actually what I missed here. I'm devastated I missed this performance. That's the drawing restraint, because that's almost like a show within the show. You did a new drawing restraint. Can you tell us about this poster? Because it's actually, I think it's with a Munich football team, right?
Yeah, it's a women's football team from Munich who dragged the block of graphite around the central room in the exhibition and left a graphite line around the wall. Mm-hmm.
Matthew, Jonathan, thank you so much. Thank you to Oki. Thank you to you all. Thank you.
Yeah, I have not figured that out.